An exhausting night march had brought Stanisław Żółkiewski, the field crown hetman of Poland, and his men to a vast field near the village of Klushino. On his command, the Polish-Lithuanian winged hussars charged forward, ready to pierce any enemy unfortunate enough to get in their way. They were welcomed by musketry, sturdy pikes, and 11 field guns. The hussars were about to clash with a Russian army superior in numbers on a very challenging battlefield. One of the most famous battles of the winged hussars and one of the most controversial ones had just begun. Żółkiewskoje. This video will contain a whole lot of names in various languages. Some of them will unfortunately be pronounced incorrectly. If you want to do better than me, then check out today's sponsor, Babbel. With Babbel, I recently learned that the Polish letter that looks like an L is actually pronounced like a W in the word rule. So it's probably something more like Stanisław Żółkiewski than Stanisław Żółkiewski, as I pronounced his name in earlier videos. So, as you can imagine, apps like Babbel are really helpful to me, especially because not all Polish or Russian names can be looked up via Google. Overall, I like that Babbel's lessons are cleverly designed, intuitive, and focus on real-life conversations, which is key to learning new languages. This enables you to actually start using the language while you travel or do business. Babbel is one of the top language learning apps in the world, so go check it out. If you use our link, you get 60% off on your subscription. It's risk-free thanks to Babbel's 20-day money-back guarantee. In 1604, Boris Fyodorovich Godunov, the Tsar of Russia, was challenged by a pretender to his throne. His rival claimed to be Dimitry, the son of Ivan the Terrible, and therefore legitimate heir to the Tsardom of Russia. Godunov ordered to arrest and question the so-called false Dimitry, but the man fled to Poland, where he quickly gained the support of several nobles and even the King of Poland and Grand Duke of Lithuania, Sigismund III. With this much backing, Dimitry hired mercenaries and acquired troops from nobles by promising them a share of the spoils in case of success. Once he had an army of about 3,500 soldiers, he set out to claim the Russian throne by force. Supported by the Cossacks and several other enemies of the Tsar, his small army conquered Chernigov, Putyvl, Sevesk, and Kursk, before they were eventually defeated. However, their cause was spared from doom when Tsar Boris Godunov died from a lengthy illness in April of 1605. His 16-year-old son, Fyodor II, followed him to the throne, but support for the boy was fickle. He was soon deserted by his army and then killed in a plot organized by Dimitry. Now, Dimitry, the pretender, installed himself on the throne, though not for long. He soon angered the boyars, the highest-ranking Russian nobles, and was killed only after a year. He was succeeded by the boyar Vasily Shuisky, a leader of the uprising against Dimitry. Vasily wasn't very popular and in 1608 faced another pretender, simply called the second false Dimitry, who claimed to be in fact the first false Dimitry who had miraculously survived the attempt on his life. The second Dimitry soon also marched towards Moscow with a large army. Confronted with this major military threat, Vasily IV had no choice but to accept an offer by the King Charles of Sweden, who was promising military support in exchange for the province of Kexholm. According to the historian Stuart Oakley, in 1609, 5,000 men, mostly Finns, under the experienced commander Jacob de la Gardie, marched to Russia in order to support the Tsar. The following joint venture of Sweden and Russia is known as the De la Gardie campaign. De la Gardie started his offensive in Vyborg, joined approximately by 3,000 Muscovites under Mikhail Skopin-Żuysky near Novgorod, and marched towards Moscow. They defeated an army of the second false Dimitry, again consisting mostly of troops from the Polish-Lithuanian Commonwealth near Tver. But most of their soldiers deserted after the battle because they hadn't been paid. De la Gardie didn't give in and returned to Novgorod, where he recruited a new and even bigger army and set out for Moscow again. After lifting the siege of Troitse Sergeyeva Larva, he arrived at the Russian capital in March of 1610, dispersed Dimitry's parallel court in Klushino and forced him to retreat. At this point, Sigismund III decided to enter the struggle and exploit the chaos. He argued that the joint venture of Sweden and Moscow had violated the current Russo-Polish armistice and claimed the Tsar's throne for himself. Soon, a substantial army marched towards the border and laid siege to Smolensk. Dimitry Żółkiewski, the brother of the Tsar, immediately began to rally an army near Mozhaisk in order to lift the siege and avert a Polish invasion. With the siege of Smolensk dragging on and Żółkiewski incoming, Sigismund's plans were in danger. He called a council of war on the 1st of June and ordered Stanisław Żółkiewski, the field crown hetman of Poland, to prepare a counterstrike. Żółkiewski left the trenches of Smolensk on the 7th of June. With about 3,000 men, mostly cavalry, he marched to Żółkiewskoje, where 2 weeks later he met with additional companies from Smolensk. Meanwhile, Żółkiewski, who had been joined by De la Gardie and his mercenaries, sent an advance force of 6,000 to 8,000 men to a village close to Żółkiewskoje. This forced the field hetman to take action. On the 24th, he attacked the strongly fortified position of the Russian vanguard, which was commanded by Grigory Valuev. The Russians, who had burned the nearby village to the ground, awaited him behind field fortifications close to a forest and a swampy area. For the next hours, the two armies engaged in indecisive skirmishes, with very light losses on both sides. When Commonwealth reinforcements arrived on the next day, the Russians quickly abandoned their field fortifications and pulled back into a well-prepared wooden fort, where they were amply supplied and had running water. Because Żółkiewski had no siege equipment, he decided to surround the camp and wait the Russians out. His strategy paid off. The circumstances in the fort deteriorated from day to day. When the news of this perilous situation reached Dimitry Żółkiewski in Mozhaisk, he was outraged. A council of war on the 1st of July decided it was not an option to abandon Grigory Valuev's men. The army got ready to move and rushed westwards in a forced march. The commanders pushed their men to their limits and beyond. Some even collapsed in the dry summer heat. On the 3rd of July, the army arrived exhausted on an open field about 5 miles east to the village of Klushino. There, Żółkiewski decided to rest. The soldiers only roughed out 2 camps, one for the Russians and one for the foreign mercenaries, and built some makeshift field fortifications out of wagons. Then they went to bed. As the Russo-Swedish army was preparing its camp, Żółkiewski called together his commanders a few miles to the south. The hetman was very secretive about his plan, but would advise all men to be on the ready. Nothing should be leaked to the Russians. Around 6 p.m., officers silently went from tent to tent with written instructions, passing orders for the following operation. Shortly before nightfall, the army left the camp. Clearly, it was put together for fast, decisive action. The wagons, most camp followers, and a guard of 5,000, mostly Zaporozhian Cossacks, remained in the camp to keep up the siege. They should pretend the whole army was still there. The part of the army that was leaving only took with it the most necessary equipment, food for 2 days and 2 small cannons. They silently left for Klushino. Early on the next morning, Żółkiewski's men were woken up by trumpets sounding alarm. Everybody got up immediately and rushed to arms. Samuel Maskiewicz, a Polish-Lithuanian officer who wrote a first-hand report about the battle, writes mockingly that in the ensuing chaos he overheard an enemy officer shout, quote, "Saddle the trousers and bring me my horse," end quote. Obviously, he couldn't have heard such a thing, as he was at the far end of the battlefield, where the troops of the Commonwealth emerged from the forest and took battle order. Between the two armies lay a flat land, narrowing towards the Russian camp near the village of Woźdzynska. To the west, it was limited by the river Wdowka, swamps and a forest. To the east by the river Gzat and 2 villages, Dziarnawka and Brzezistoje. The hetman ordered his men to burn Brzezistoje and another small hamlet, Pierniewo, to the ground and destroy a series of fences. For the most part, we do not know the location or make of these fences. Some sources describe them as sturdy palisades, others as simple pasture fences. Most likely, they primarily had an agricultural function, but they were still a significant obstacle for the Polish-Lithuanian cavalry. The men of the Commonwealth cleared the way, but in some places only partially. In a fence stretching from Dziarnawka, they only made some gaps. This would become a major problem later on. While the exact topography of the battlefield has sparked some discussion, The question of numbers has caused heated debates. Most of the Polish primary accounts massively overstate the difference in size of the armies to magnify the achievement of the winged hussars. Samuel Maskiewicz, for example, estimates that 2,700 Commonwealth troops faced 50,000 Russians and mercenaries. While the Russians indeed outnumbered the Commonwealth, such an immense imbalance has been dismissed by almost all modern scholars. More considered estimates, for example the one of Robert Frost, a Western expert on the Northern Wars, arrive at roughly 5,000 winged hussars, 1,000 Cossack light cavalry, and 200 infantry, with 2 falconets on the Polish-Lithuanian side, against 5,000 to 7,000 mercenaries and 16,000 soldiers on the Russian side, not including 14,000 peasant auxiliaries with 11 cannons. In fact, not only are the numbers controversial, but also the course of events. Because it hasn't been fully reconstructed yet, we mainly stick to the accounts of 2 Polish experts, Radosław Sikora and Przemysław Gawron, while also taking into account Western perspectives such as Robert Frost's. While Żółkiewski succeeded in surprising the enemy, it's quite likely that much of the advantage was lost because it took a lot of time to remove the obstacles on the battlefield. This gave Świeski's army time to deploy in an orderly fashion. De la Gardie had supreme command over the mercenaries who took the right flank, Świeski over the Russians on the left flank. Because of the limited space on the narrow battlefield, they couldn't exploit their numerical superiority and set up in a somewhat deeper manner than usual, with the mercenaries in a slightly advanced position. Both armies were ready for battle. Around dawn, Żółkiewski started the attack. Outflanking was impossible due to the terrain, so that the only option was a frontal attack. Zborowski's hussars opened the battle by charging a regiment of Finnish cavalry under Everett Horn. Horn's Finns, surprised by the momentum of their charge, only put up a short fight and then retreated. When the hussars tried to follow through, they were stopped by the mercenary reiters in the second line, cuirassiers and mounted arquebusiers, that is. While these 2 cavalry units struggled, Struss's regiment of winged hussars charged the Taube infantry on the left flank. They had a hard time because Taube used what was still standing of the fence stretching east from Jernavka as cover. In finest pike and shot manner, his musketeers welcomed the hussars with volley fire before stepping behind the pikemen who absorbed the impact of the charges. Struss's men were forced to attack in small groups of 10 because the gaps didn't allow for many horses to pass through at once, while the musketeers could focus their fire on them. To change this unbearable situation, the hussars needed to charge the actual fence before they could attack Taube's men. This caused several losses, but after some time the gap was wide enough for the hussars to attack in proper formation. Over the course of the next hour they charged and wheeled back 3 times, but the experienced and battle-hardened mercenaries stood firm. The situation only tipped in favor of the attackers when the infantry of the rearguard arrived. 200 haiduks, who were late because the falconets they had with them had been bogged down in the forest. The haiduks joined Struss, and together they managed to break the resistance of the Taube regiment. In a combined attack, artillery, infantry and hussars forced them into retreat. Taube's men dispersed and most of them fled to the nearby forest. But Struss's cavalry was stopped by the reiters in the second line too. After wheeling back and reforming, the hussars attacked them from the front and left flank at the same time. At this point, most of the hussars had shattered their lances and attacked with outflung swords and sabers. It seems like the reiters had fired their pistols, and without time to reload, now relied on their sabers as well. But the hussars' 2-pronged attack threw the reiters into disorder. Simultaneously, another hussar unit, most likely Kazanowski or Dunikowski, or both, circumvented their comrades to the right and charged the Russian cavalry commanded by Vasily Buturlin. According to Radosław Sikora, this was the first actual encounter of Russian and Commonwealth troops at Klushino. At this point, some of the hussars had charged their enemy 7 or 8 times. Samuel Maskiewicz reports, quote, "Our arms and armor were damaged, and our strength ebbing from such frequent regrouping and charges against the enemy." Nevertheless, Buturlin's cavalry cracked and fled the field. Żółkiewski commanded the Russian infantry himself. His men were worried by the sight of their fleeing cavalry, but he calmed them down and arrayed them in front of their camp. At this point, the mercenary infantry had also taken up position behind the field fortifications near their camp, while the remaining 6 companies of reiters were positioned in the front. 2 of them performed the caracole, one of the most common Western cavalry tactics at the time. Again, Mickiewicz took part in the encounter. He writes that the first rank of reiters came at them, fired their pistols, and then wheeled away to make room for the second rank. When the second rank had fired, quote, "We did not wait, but at the moment all had emptied their pieces, we charged them with our sabers in our hands. They, having failed to reload, while the next rank had not yet fired, took to their heels. The reiters fled, thereby throwing Żółkiewski's infantry into disarray." This was too much for many a Russian soldier, especially for the inexperienced auxiliaries. For several hours they had been nervously expecting the enemy to get to them, and their cavalry had left, and their reassuring organization had been ripped apart. Panic was spreading. When the Commonwealth troops finally reached them, resistance was virtually inexistent. The Russians turned to flight as well, so that within a blink of an eye, the hussars were amidst them and even in their camp. Seeing this, the Russian organization decayed into mayhem. Many ran headlong, chased by the Polish cavalry. The hussars pursued them blindly and left those Russians who remained in the camp to restore the defenses. There, Żółkiewski's army was ready to fight its last stand. As some hussars were also pursuing the fleeing reiters, only Kazanowski, Wilkowski, and Żółkiewski remained on the battlefield and faced the fire from the enemy guns. Both Russians and mercenaries had now dug in their camps and tried to weaken the Commonwealth army with a barrage of their 11 guns. This prompted the remainder of Taube's routed infantry to emerge from the safety of the forest and join their comrades in the camp. Żółkiewski realized that it made no sense to attack the camps given this new situation. His men were too few and too tired to attack the enemy in a fortified position. Only at around 10 a.m. most of the hussars returned to the battlefield. The hetman wanted to take his time, rest, regroup, and then attack with full force. His subordinates, however, anticipated his plan and charged the mercenary camp on their own. They allegedly made it past the pikes of the infantry, awaiting them, and right into the heart of the camp. However, this certainly must be taken with a grain of salt, especially as the sources report that the mercenaries then miraculously pushed the hussars back out of their camp, which seems unlikely after they had just been overrun. Howsoever this attack may have played out, Żółkiewski soon gathered his men and arrayed them in front of the mercenary camp. He offered terms to the foreign soldiers, more specifically to either join his army or leave unhampered. Horn and de la Gardie tried to keep their men from leaving, but their urging and pleading was to no avail. The mercenaries saw no use in fighting a lost fight. When Żółkiewski heard of this, he made up his mind quickly and fled, followed by the bulk of his infantry. Although some of the hussars chased them, the majority focused on looting the abandoned camp. Meanwhile, the mercenaries dispersed. Some 300 to 400 left with de la Gardie and Horn for Novgorod, while the rest joined the ranks of the Commonwealth. After 5 hours, the battle had come to an end. Hearing of the defeat, the Russian soldiers at Sarajevo-Zaimoście surrendered. In the wake of this defeat, Tsar Vasily IV was disposed by the boyars. The Polish prince, Władysław IV Wasa, was proclaimed Tsar for the time being, and Żółkiewski marched to occupy Moscow. However, Władysław never assumed the throne, because his father failed to negotiate a lasting agreement with the boyars. In 1612, the Polish-Lithuanian occupation of Moscow ended, and in 1613 the title of Tsar went back to a Russian as the first Tsar of the long-reigning House of Romanov. Michael I rose to the throne.